Welcome to the 10-minute series of videos related to competency-based programs. My name is Madeleine Bazergi from the Office of Academic Development at Dawson College, and I'm pleased to present characteristics of learning outcomes. This cartoon strip is a good segue to this presentation. The evidence that this student has learned to whistle is that he can whistle. We would expect at the end of the whistling course that the student can whistle in order to call his dog. Writing learning outcomes is the key to a well-designed course. They are essential for aligning the learning activities with the assessments and with the objectives and standards. It is truly an art to write well-crafted learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are the results of learning, not what learners have learned or what was taught, but what they can do with what they have learned. Ideally, they're observable, measurable, relevant, and achievable within a specific time period. The statements define the knowledge, skills, and attitudes, or the integration of knowledge, skills, and attitudes learners will be expected to demonstrate at the end of a learning period. Let me give you an example of some learning outcomes. In this video series, you'll learn how to write good learning outcomes. You'll learn about the characteristics of learning outcomes, but at the end of the video series, you should be able to craft learning outcomes of your own for your courses, and this based on the competencies to be developed. And you'll also be able to verify that the learning outcomes are SMART, and that the taxonomic level of the outcomes align with the objectives and standards elaborated in the Ministerial Devis. Note, I will not expect you to remember the theory or characteristics of learning outcomes, but that you apply what you have learned to produce something. In this case, your own learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are always described in terms of the learner and highlight the end state, the result of the lesson, module, course, semester, profile, or even a program. A great way to remember the characteristics of learning outcomes is to use the SMART acronym. The outcomes need to be specific enough to be observable, but not so specific that they are limiting and cannot be applied to a variety of situations. Learning outcomes must also be measurable so that you can clearly imagine an assessment directly tied to the outcome. Learning outcomes need to be achievable. Your expectations must be realistic given the time students have to achieve these. And they must be relevant to the development of the competency. What you expect of students must be tied to the objectives and standards. Lastly, they are time-bound, meaning that learning outcomes can be written for end of lessons, end of courses, or programs. Learning outcomes answer the question, what should students be able to do at the end of a learning period, at the end of a lesson, a unit, a course, a profile, or a program? They clearly communicate what successful learning performance looks like, so that students know exactly what will be expected of them by the end of the learning period. So what's the difference between a competency and an outcome? The main distinction between a competency and a true learning outcome is that a learning outcome is written so that it can be measured or assessed. A competency is exercised, and a learning outcome is the results of the competencies in action. Let me give you an example. If you recall from a previous presentation, a competency is a general statement that implies the mobilization of knowledge, skills, and attitudes. Learning outcomes, on the other hand, are very specific statements that describe exactly what a student will be able to do in some measurable way when exercising the competency. This competency to perform musical works is not vague, it is general, so that it can be exercised in a variety of situations. For example, with a piano or violin in front of an audience in a jazz club or for a recording. Let's take a look at the learning outcomes for a third-year course of a profile of a music program. There are two profiles, one in jazz music and the other in classical music. You'll note that the learning outcomes are aligned with the elements of the competency, as well as the performance criteria, but they're not shown here in order to simplify the example. By the end of this third-year course, students will be able to perform a classical piece on the piano in front of an audience. Although they are in the jazz profile, they should be able to play different musical genres, as you can see in the competency elements. At the end of the course, students will also be able to perform a Latin jazz piece on the piano in front of an audience, accompany a jazz singer on the piano, and perform a jazz solo incorporating other genres. In this particular course and in this profile, emphasis of the final assessment is on Latin jazz. You can think of the learning outcomes as competencies in action. You'll also note that this one competency has several outcomes, and this is typical of learning outcomes. In competency-based programs and in the courses that we offer, we help students develop the foundational knowledge they need to be able to exercise the competency integrally. We also give students many opportunities to hone their skills and encourage the appropriate attitudes. We may assess foundational knowledge and skills along the way, but at the end of a course or a series of courses, students must demonstrate their ability to integrate all of this by exercising the competency to perform musical works. The competency is exercised by mobilizing the knowledge, skills, and attitudes. The learning outcomes make clear to the student what is expected of them at the end of the course, and we can easily imagine a final assessment. This final assessment requires the students to exercise the competency in order to demonstrate the course learning outcomes. And by inference, we can attest to the achievement of the competency. Learning outcomes can be written for different learning periods or levels as learning is scaffolded in a program. At the end of a lesson, a unit, a course, a program profile, or a program. The difference is in what you expect students to be able to do at different points on their learning journey, with mastery of very specific skills and knowledge at the beginning to the integration of knowledge, skills, and attitudes at the end. The higher up on the pyramid, the more complex and integrative the learning outcomes are. Here are some examples. At the end of this lesson, students will be able to play all the major scales and chords on the piano. At the end of the unit, students will be able to sight read and play a simple pop song on their instrument. You can see how the lesson level outcomes are specific to the foundational knowledge, and that as we move up the pyramid, the outcomes become more encompassing of the knowledge, skills, and attitudes developed. Similarly, at the end of this course, students will be able to improvise a solo to a jazz piece. But at the end of the program, students will be able to play different musical genres on their instrument with a full orchestra or ensemble in front of an audience. Learning outcomes are tied to assessment. Program-level learning outcomes are packaged in an exit profile. If we know what we want students to be able to do at the end of the program, the comprehensive examination is the means by which we judge the achievement of the exit profile outcomes. Course-level outcomes represent what we expect students to be able to do at the end of a course, and the final evaluation of the course is the means by which we judge the achievement of course outcomes. It is summative in nature because the final evaluation should require students to mobilize learning in the course by performing a complex task or solving a complex problem. At the end of a lesson, the lesson level outcomes can be assessed using frequent formative assessments. Assessments in competency-based programs will be addressed in another series of videos. So why write learning outcomes? Learning outcomes makes clear what is expected from students when they exercise competencies. When presented at the start, they point to learning goals and act as a learning contract for a lesson, a unit, a course, or a program. Learning outcomes drive the development of course content, learning, and assessment activities. And they provide a benchmark against which learning can be assessed. They also provide a consistent experience across different sections. More importantly, when you know what results to expect at the end of a learning period, it becomes easier to align the learning and assessment activities. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next presentation where we examine how to write good learning outcomes.